Excellent. Now that we've seen how we can make macros inside of a single blueprint, let's take a look at how we can make a macro library. A macro library will allow us to create a couple of different macros, as many as we need, that can then be used in any of our blueprints so that we're able to kind of just grab them whenever we need them. So for example, that checking if it was the player class, we had a number of different places where we wanted to do that. A number of different triggers that had to check to see, is it the player that entered the trigger or is it a different object? Well, if we're going to do that, we don't want to have to make that code in every single one of those, and we don't want to have to make a macro in every single one of those. So instead, we're going to make a universal macro library. We can do that by going to our content browser, right-clicking, going to Blueprints, Blueprint Macro Library. It's going to ask us for a parent class. This parent class is going to change what kind of functions we have access to inside of this macro. Right now, we want our macro only to affect actors. So I'm just going to make it a parent class of actor. There we go. There's our macro library. It's by default going to be named new macro library. You can give it a custom name based on what it kind of follows so that you can make multiples of these. So if I open my macro library, we'll notice it looks a lot like our blueprint event graph, except we don't have an event graph. So there's no button up here for construction script. There's no button up here for event graph because there is nothing that this object does. It is nothing but macros. It is only macros. So if you see on the side, we've got a list of the macros that are available. I can add new macros to this list by clicking my add button. And I can just keep adding as many macros as I want. And these macros will be available for me inside of any actor blueprint once I have them created. So think about all of the code that you might want to reuse and have available. So I'm going to recreate the one that we did before, just so that we can kind of see it in action and see how we can add this to our blueprints as we go. So I'm going to have to rename this macro because I don't want it to have that weird new macro 0 name. So I'm going to call it just is actor player class. Just like before, I'm going to speed through this time though, because I am going to have the same idea. We're going to have our inputs. The first thing we're going to need is where kind of the power comes in, right? In many of the Epic samples, they call this test because they're saying, oh, this is where the power for the test is. In other times, we might want to call it input. It's just up to you what you want to say. This is where kind of the power comes in. I'm going to need 2 for outputs. 1 for is. So actor is player class. And 1 for actor is not player class. Right? So now that I have my actor here, you'll notice I was on the wrong window. I was up here on macro 2. So here we go. As I set those, they show up on these items. The other input that I'm going to need here is I'm going to need my actor to test. And that's going to be of type actor. Actor to test, we're going to do a get class. We're going to check if that class is equal to. The class we're checking for is our third person character. And we're going to do a branch off of that. If the branch is true, we are that player class. If not, we are false. We are not. When the input comes in, it's just going to run that branch, do that check to see if it's the same, send the correct output. Now I have a macro that's inside of my macro library. So I can save my macro library, close out of it. And now if I were to open another one of my triggers, so last time I did the door trigger. So let me go door key press trigger. Now we have this section here where we're checking if the player is the trigger. And I had to do that multiple times. But what I'll find is that now I can get rid of that and I can bring in from my macro library, right, is actor player class. So under utilities, right, here's my macro is actor player class. And there we go. There's my input. There's my actor to test. If it is, I'm going to activate the door trigger. And now I've got this node that I kind of created myself. It's my personal node that works in my project. And because it's in my macro library, I have access to it. And so now anytime I need to do that check, I just use my node. So you're going to be able to create lots of cool macros that work in different games that you're going to use. Thinking in terms of creating your own custom nodes. So instead of trying to draw out and create these big, crazy blueprints that have lots of tasks to them, create your own macros and your own custom nodes so that it's very easy to read, so that your blueprints are very short and easy to understand. Think about creating events whenever you want an event to occur. So if something new happens, make an event that goes off, because that way you can access those events from anywhere. You'll notice that I can't just access this node. I have to go through an event to access it. But you'll be able to do that with your own custom events. So custom events and macros and a macro library, very powerful tools that you can use to make your code easy to understand, easy to read. You can make it easy to build by creating these macros even when you don't know what they're going to do yet. So if I go back to my macro library, so I'm going to save out of this one here, and I'll go back to my macro library. I might have a macro here, right, that I can rename, that I can say this is going to be a macro for something like is player uber powered, right? And I don't even know what uber powered means yet, right? But what I can do is I can say, look, here's my node that comes in, and I'm going to say, look, there's an input node that is a type execute, right? Here's my input. I know I'm going to need an output node for yes, right? Player is Uber. Another one for player is not Uber. And then I'm going to pass in an input here that is going to be of my, player type. So that was, remember, third person character. And then right now, I just know that this is going to branch. That if it's true, I'm going to say yes and come out. And if it's false, it's not. And then I'm just going to leave this, right, for now. And I can make a big comment for it that says, to do, make this actually do the checks. This is a stub function or macro. So this is a stub macro. So now I can use this in my code and start building around it, even though it doesn't function correctly. It doesn't do the right answer. This one's going to say, yes, you're always Uber. No matter what, player's always going to be Uber, no matter what that means. But what it allows you to do is allows you to build a lot of other things and then come back and fill this in later, right? It's something that you can build at a later time when you can figure it out. Or, making games is a team sport. You're going to do it as part of a team. You might be able to then pass this off to the engineering team, and the engineering team writes this macro for you, and you just use it in your levels in the different places. So if you find a place where you need to do something, but you don't know how, make a macro in the macro library, give it a default value, right? Like in this case, the default value is true. It's always going to be Uber. And then build the rest of your code around it, test it out, change the default value. So change this from true to false. Do your tests again, see if it works. If it does, then hand this off to engineering to write the more complex checks that you might not know how to do. That's going to be something that as a designer, it's not a problem. It's not an issue, right? Like you're building the game as a team. It's kind of expected that if there's a difficult coding section, something that's hard to do, you could pass that off to the engineering team to write that code. But when you pass it off to them, you're going to want to pass it off inside of one of these macros so that they only have to work in the macro. They don't have to touch the rest of your level. All they have to do is build the macro to work correctly. So they would build their own levels with their own tests, their own elements, and all that they're doing is updating a macro. And making sure that that macro works correctly. You're making sure that if that macro worked correctly, everything else works according to your level. And that way, both of you can continue working at the same time. You don't have to wait for them to finish. On a more advanced level, you'll find that your engineers might even take your macro and instead of using it as a macro, create it in C++ instead of Blueprint to make things go faster. So a lot of the things that you're doing, if you're able to split them up into small macros that make little checks, your engineering team is able to take that macro, delete it out of Blueprint, and replace it with one that is in C++, which is faster and more efficient. And that way they're able to speed the game up without breaking any of your code, because all they're doing is just swapping out your macro. Excellent. In our next section, we're going to take a look at some more tools that we can use to make our code even easier for us to create.